There's a strange silence that follows you when you choose to walk alone. The world doesn't quite know what to make of it. People ask if you're lonely, if something went wrong, if you've given up on love. Yet, deep inside, there's a small defiant flame, a sense that perhaps this path of solitude isn't emptiness at all, but something sacred. We live in a culture that worships attachment. To be single is often seen as a waiting room, a temporary phase before real life begins. But what if Nietzsche was right when he said that the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe? What if solitude is not a deficit, but a declaration that one's inner life deserves space to breathe before it fuses with another? Carl Jung believed that most relationships fail not because of a lack of love, but because we meet others before we have met ourselves. To him, the path toward wholeness, what he called individuation, required a confrontation with one's own depths, the shadow, the anima or animus, the forgotten fragments of the psyche. Without that confrontation, love becomes a form of avoidance, two incomplete selves clinging to each other in fear of their own emptiness. But the person who learns to stand alone, truly alone, begins to touch a deeper kind of intimacy with life itself. Nietzsche called this the great liberation, to unlearn dependence, to become one's own companion, philosopher, and lover of life. In this exploration, we will uncover 6 profound insights that reveal why staying single, or at least learning to be alone, may be one of the most transformative choices you can make. These insights draw on the wisdom of Nietzsche and Jung, but also on timeless ideas from Stoicism, Eastern philosophy, and modern psychology. This is not about rejecting love, but about learning how to be so whole within yourself that when love does appear, it is no longer a refuge from loneliness, but a meeting of two worlds that no longer need to escape themselves. There's a quiet moment that arrives in every honest life, a moment when you realize you've been living for approval, not consciously perhaps, but if you look closely, so many of your choices, what you wear, what you pursue, even what you dream of, were shaped by invisible hands. The opinions of friends, family, culture, the subtle desire to belong. Nietzsche called this the herd instinct, a collective hypnosis that makes us trade our authenticity for acceptance. Most people never notice it because the tribe rewards obedience. It promises safety, belonging, validation. But Nietzsche warned, whoever cannot command himself must obey, and most of us, without realizing it, obey. The tragedy is that obedience often disguises itself as virtue. We call it being realistic, doing the right thing, or fitting in, yet underneath there's a quiet betrayal of the self, the slow suffocation of one's inner voice beneath the weight of social comfort. Stepping outside the tribe is an ascent about rebellion for its own sake, is an ascent about reclaiming authorship of your own life. Nietzsche believed that freedom begins the moment we stop asking, "What will others think?" and begin asking, "What do I truly value?" This question, simple as it seems, can shatter everything, because to answer it honestly, you have to strip away layers of conditioning. You have to confront how much of you isn't really you. He urged us to become who we are, not who we're told to be, not even who we wish to be, but who we are, the unfiltered essence beneath performance and pretense. And this, Nietzsche said, requires solitude. Solitude is not isolation, It's not withdrawal from the world out of bitterness or pride. It's a sacred workshop of transformation. When you walk alone, the noise of the tribe begins to fade, and for the first time you can hear your own thoughts echo in the silence. But that silence can be terrifying. You start to notice the fears that once hid beneath busyness, the fear of insignificance, of being unseen, of being misunderstood. And yet this discomfort is the birthplace of freedom. Nietzsche compared it to climbing a mountain. The air gets thinner, the path lonelier, but the view becomes infinite. When you stop performing, something miraculous happens. Life stops being a stage and becomes a canvas. You begin to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. You start creating rather than conforming. But freedom demands sacrifice. The tribe will not cheer for your independence. It will question it. People may interpret your solitude as arrogance or loneliness. They may try to pull you back with guilt or fear. Nietzsche sips advice. Don't sit seek the truth and others sits eyes. The higher self can only be born once you have faced the pain of being misunderstood. Think of every great thinker, artist, or sage, from Socrates to Kierkegaard, from Emerson to Nietzsche himself. They all had to walk alone. They were misunderstood precisely because they were seeing from a higher altitude. To walk alone is to stop needing permission to exist. It's to carry your own approval, your own direction, your own peace. Nietzsche's free spirit isn't a rebel in anger, but a creator in love with life, liberated from imitation. So, if you find yourself walking a solitary path, feeling detached from the noise of others, perhaps it's not because you're lost. Perhaps it's because you're finally beginning. Let this solitude not shrink you, but sculpt you. Let it burn away what is false, until only what is yours remains. Because the moment you no longer need to belong to the tribe, you finally belong to yourself. Once you step outside the tribe, you enter silence. And in that silence, something unsettling begins to happen. You start meeting yourself. Not the self you show to the world, but the one that hides behind the mask. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the part of us that contains everything we deny, repress, or fear about ourselves. Our anger, jealousy, vulnerability, shame, but also, strangely, our hidden creativity, strength, and authenticity. The shadow is not just darkness, it's the unlived life within us. Most people never face it. They drown it in distraction, relationships, work, noise, anything to avoid that mirror. But when you choose solitude, there's nowhere left to hide. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting everything you've avoided seeing. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's the quiet tragedy of the unexamined life. What we don't face within, we project onto others. We criticize in others what we secretly fear in ourselves. We chase in others what we've disowned in ourselves. We love, we hate, we idealize, but all of it is our own soul, playing dress-up in the faces of others. This is why Jung believed solitude wasn't a punishment. It was a rite of passage. Alone, we finally meet the stranger within, and though it's uncomfortable, this encounter is the foundation of all genuine growth. Imagine your psyche as a vast, ancient house. Most people live only in the brightly lit front rooms, the socially acceptable, polished parts. But solitude invites you to walk down the corridor into the locked basement, the forgotten rooms filled with dust and memory. And if you're brave enough to turn on the light, you discover that the monsters you feared were often misunderstood children, parts of you longing to be seen, not banished. When Jung worked with patients, he didn't try to make them good, he tried to make them whole. Wholeness, he said, is far greater than perfection. Perfection divides us, wholeness reconciles us. To integrate the shadow means to accept that you are capable of both light and darkness, and to live consciously with both. It's a deeply humbling process, because as you see your shadow, you begin to see everyone else's too, and compassion is born. You realize how fragile, how complex, how human we all are. The judgment softens, the need to appear flawless dissolves. But make no mistake, this work is not easy. The shadow resists illumination. It hides behind pride, blame, and fear. Jung compared it to descending into a personal underworld, like Orpheus searching for Eurydice, or Christ descending into hell. It's a symbolic death, the death of denial, of self-deception, of the false persona. And yet, if you stay long enough in that inner night, something extraordinary begins to happen. The darkness starts to reveal its wisdom. The very qualities you once rejected, your sensitivity, your rage, your vulnerability, become sources of depth and vitality. To know your shadow is to gain power, not over others, but over yourself. The person who can sit with their darkness no longer fears the darkness in the world. This is why Jung saw solitude as sacred. It's the crucible in which the fragments of the self begin to fuse. You stop chasing others to complete you because you've begun to reclaim the lost pieces of your own soul. When you meet someone who has done their shadow work, you feel it. There's a groundedness, a quiet strength. They don't need to impress or dominate. Their presence feels safe, not because they are perfect, but because they are real. So, when loneliness knocks, don't rush to fill it. Sit with it. Let it show you what you've avoided, because in that mirror lies the map to your wholeness. The shadow is Azista, your enemy. Idhista is your guide. And when you can finally look it in the eye and say, I see you and I accept you, you begin the long, beautiful work of becoming human. At some point in our solitude, a new kind of longing begins to stir. Not the desperate hunger for companionship that once haunted our loneliness, but a quieter yearning to share the inner richness we've discovered. To love, not as escape, but as expansion. Most relationships begin as unconscious bargains. I will give you comfort if you fill my emptiness. I will give you affection if you give me identity. It's rarely spoken, but silently felt, this mutual exchange of needs disguised as love. Carl Jung warned that when two people meet, four people are actually present, the man and the woman, and each of their inner images, the anima and animus, their hidden counterparts. We don't fall in love with a person at first, but with an image, a reflection of our own missing parts projected onto them. That's why love can feel intoxicating and maddening at once. It's as if the universe has handed us the missing piece of our soul. But soon reality arrives, and the image fades. The projection collapses, and we're left facing an actual human being, imperfect, complex, other. This is where most relationships break, when the dream dissolves and the shadow enters. But Jung saw this as the most sacred stage of love, the moment when fantasy gives way to truth, when we begin to see the other not as an answer to our emptiness, but as a mirror of our wholeness. Nietzsche, too, mistrusted romantic dependency. He once wrote that love is the most noble and most deceptive of all instincts. Noble, because it reveals our capacity to transcend the self. Deceptive, because it often hides the fear of being alone. He believed that great love requires two strong souls, not halves seeking completion, but whole beings choosing to walk together. Love, he said, is not the possession of one soul by another, but the reverence of one sep's solitude by another sep's solitude. To love maturely, then, is to bring your own inner wholeness to the table. It is to say, I have met my shadow. I have walked through my loneliness. I don't instead need you to complete me, but I choose to meet you freely. This is what Erich Fromm later called mature love, the union under the condition of preserving one's integrity. Two people standing side by side, not entangled, but aligned. It changes everything. Conversations deepen because there is no longer the pressure to be understood entirely. Disagreements soften because you are no longer fighting for validation. Silence becomes comfortable, even sacred, because solitude has already taught you how to be with yourself. This is why solitude is the foundation of intimacy. The one who cannot sit alone will always use others as escape routes from their own mind. But the one who has befriended themselves can finally meet another as an equal traveler, not a savior, not a possession, but a companion on the path. In that sense, love becomes less like a contract and more like a dance. Two souls moving in rhythm, each retaining their own gravity. But this kind of love asks for courage, because when you no longer depend on another to fill you, you must take full responsibility for your inner state. You can no longer blame someone else for your unhappiness, nor rely on their affection as proof of your worth. And yet, paradoxically, this is when love becomes pure, not born of fear, but of freedom. If you ever meet someone who has done the work, who has walked alone, faced their shadow, and learned to be whole, their presence feels different. There is a quiet, steady warmth about them. They don't cling, they don't demand, they simply are. That's what true love feels like. Not two desperate hands reaching out of fear of falling, but two steady hearts walking together, each whole, each free. There is a moment, after the noise of the world fades and the ache of loneliness quiets, when solitude begins to change shape. It no longer feels like emptiness, it feels like space. And within that space, something begins to move, something ancient, alive, and creative. Nietzsche believed that solitude is not an escape from life, but a return to its source. He called it creative solitude, the sacred condition in which one can finally hear the whisper of their own becoming. Become who you are, he wrote, by learning what you are. It sounds simple, almost circular, but within it lies one of life's greatest challenges: to transform solitude from stagnation into creation, from silence into symphony. When we are surrounded by others, we unconsciously perform. We edit ourselves to fit the room, soften our edges to avoid friction. But when we are alone, the masks fall away, and for the first time, we can ask, without performance, who am I when no one is watching? Most people never dare to ask that, because to answer it honestly means to confront the terrifying truth that identity is not given, it must be created. Nietzsche saw this as both a burden and a privilege. We are the poets of our own lives, he said. We must arrange the chaos within us. Solitude, then, is not passive. It is a workshop of the soul, a furnace where experience is melted down and reshaped into meaning. Great art, great thought, and even great peace, they all emerge from that inner workshop. It's not about producing something for the world to see. It's about crafting a self that feels true. The way an artist shapes marble or a writer shapes words, solitude allows you to shape yourself. But creation requires friction. Nietzsche knew this well. To become who you are means to wrestle with doubt, confusion, and despair, to descend into what he called the chaos from which a dancing star is born. You will face boredom, insecurity, the weight of meaninglessness. Yet, if you can endure them, they become teachers rather than tormentors. In solitude, the soul rearranges itself. You begin to see patterns in your pain, symbols in your struggles. What once felt like chaos starts to feel like compost, the dark, fertile ground from which growth arises. Jung would later echo this idea. He said that creativity is not an act of the ego, but of the self, the deeper psyche trying to express its wholeness. In moments of solitude, that deeper self whispers through intuition, dream, image, and impulse. You begin to feel drawn towards certain pursuits, ideas, or callings, not out of ambition, but resonance. That's how the authentic life begins, not with a grand decision, but with a quiet listening. Nietzsche believed that few people ever reach this stage because they confuse busyness with aliveness. They run from one distraction to another, terrified of the silence that would reveal their own unrealized potential. But the creator, the true individual, dares to enter that silence, even when it feels unbearable. If you can stay there long enough, you start to sense a strange joy, the joy of becoming, the kind that comes when you realize that meaning isn't found, it's forged. To live creatively doesn't necessarily mean to paint or write. It means to live intentionally, to turn your existence into an expression of your inner truth, to build habits, relationships, and work that mirror the person you are becoming. Nietzsche saw this as the highest act of freedom, not rebellion, but creation, the courage to shape one's life as art. So when you find yourself alone, don't rush to fill the emptiness. Sit with it. Listen. Let the silence become your teacher, because within that silence lies a design, your design waiting to be born. Every great life, every meaningful creation begins here, in the sacred solitude of the Soul Sep's workshop, where you stop imitating and start becoming. At a certain depth of solitude, something unexpected happens. You stop searching for answers and begin to notice the silence itself. At first, it feels empty, then strangely alive. There's a pulse to it, a quiet intelligence that doesn't speak in words, but in sensations, the rhythm of your breath, the still hum of awareness behind every thought. Carl Jung called this the movement toward the self, the center of the psyche that holds the totality of who we are, conscious and unconscious. It's not the ego, not the anxious voice that plans and worries, but something far older, deeper, and wiser. He often compared it to the Eastern concept of the Atman, or Tao, the unchanging ground of being that underlies all experience. In solitude, once the noise of identity dissolves, you begin to sense this presence. You are no longer merely thinking, you are being. Eastern philosophy has always pointed toward this truth. The Stoics spoke of ataraxia, a serene imperturbability born of inner order. The Buddhists called it sunyata, the stillness of emptiness that contains all things, and the Taoists, perhaps most beautifully, described it as wu wei, effortless alignment with the natural flow of life. Jung was deeply moved by these ideas. He saw in them what Western psychology had forgotten, that healing is not only about integration of the self, but communion with something greater than the self. When we enter deep solitude, the boundaries between me and world begin to blur. You start to feel that the same intelligence that grows trees, moves oceans, and turns seasons also animates you. The loneliness begins to soften because you are no longer alone. You are part of something vast and interconnected. This stillness does not arrive dramatically. It unfolds quietly. Like dawn, one morning you wake up and realize that the things which used to disturb you now pass through like clouds. You respond instead of react. You observe without grasping. There's a subtle grace in the way you move through the world. Jung called this a religious attitude, not belief in a doctrine, but reverence for the mystery of existence itself. When the ego loosens its grip, life begins to guide you through intuition rather than control. You no longer chase meaning. Meaning begins to find you. Nietzsche, despite his critique of religion, also touched this depth when he wrote, "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things." That's the wisdom of stillness, the ability to say yes to life as it is, without resistance. In this space, time slows. The mind stops trying to solve itself. You begin to sense that perhaps the purpose of solitude isn't to find yourself, but to lose the false layers that hide you from the eternal quiet beneath. This is what mystics across ages have described in different tongues. The moment when the observer and the observed become one, when you no longer stand apart from life trying to master it, but move with it in harmony. It doesn't mean withdrawing from the world forever. True stillness isn't isolation, it's inner alignment. You can walk through crowded streets or hold a loved one's hand and still feel that same silence, a calm presence beneath every heartbeat. To live from this stillness is to carry solitude within you, even in company, to speak without losing the quiet, to love without losing the self. When Jung described the self as the God within, he didn't mean arrogance. He meant awareness, the kind that sees all of life as sacred, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. And that's the paradox of deep solitude. The deeper you go into yourself, the more you dissolve into everything. You begin alone and end in unity. Every transformation begins with pain. And for many, that pain is loneliness. It's the sharp ache in the chest when the room feels too quiet. The moment you reach for your phone and realize there's no one to text. The nights when the silence feels so heavy, it almost presses against your skin. But what if this loneliness isn't a curse? What if it's an initiation, the soul's way of calling you home? Nietzsche believed that loneliness is the price of freedom. The higher we soar, he wrote, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. When you choose solitude, not as retreat, but as discovery, you inevitably outgrow the familiar. You begin to see through illusions that once comforted you. And though that clarity can feel isolating, it is also the first breath of real independence. Jung would have agreed. He said that the individual path toward wholeness is a narrow, steep road, often lonely, but never empty, because once you face yourself, your shadow, your fears, your hidden depths, Loneliness becomes something different. It's no longer the absence of company, it's the presence of yourself. This is where the transformation begins. Loneliness asks you to build a relationship with your own soul, to stop seeking constant distraction and start cultivating inner companionship. You begin to notice that there's an entire world within you: ideas, sensations, intuitions, dreams, all waiting to be listened to. And the more you listen, the more your solitude begins to glow. You start doing things not because they fill time, but because they feed you. Reading becomes communion, walks become meditation, creating, thinking, breathing. All of it starts to feel like participation in something intimate and infinite at once. Nietzsche called this amor fati, the love of one's fate. It's not mere acceptance of solitude, but gratitude for it. The realization that the very thing that once felt like deprivation has become your liberation. He envisioned the Übermensch, the Overman, as the one who transcends dependency, not a tyrant or a god, but a human being who no longer seeks validation outside themselves. The Übermensch is not cold, they are complete. They no longer need the crowd to echo their worth because they have found meaning within. Jung's equivalent was the individuated person, the one who has integrated both light and shadow, masculine and feminine, reason and instinct. The individuated soul doesn't isolate itself out of fear. It walks alone out of freedom. And here lies the great paradox. The more comfortable you become in solitude, the more capable you are of true connection, because you are no longer entering relationships out of need, but out of abundance. This transformation does instead happen overnight. It happens quietly, through small acts of courage, choosing stillness when you could choose distraction, telling the truth when you could please others, listening to your own intuition when the world shouts in 1,000 directions. Each of these moments, tiny as they seem, strengthens your inner sovereignty. Eventually, loneliness stops being something to escape. It becomes your teacher and then your ally. You realize that solitude is not the opposite of love, but its foundation, because only the free can truly love. Only the whole can truly give. When you reach this stage, a subtle power awakens, not dominance, but presence, the kind that walks into a room quietly but changes its atmosphere. You've stopped chasing belonging because you are belonging to life itself. This is the gift of solitude. It transforms isolation into intimacy, pain into wisdom, silence into strength. Nietzsche once said, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." Loneliness is that chaos, the ache that refines the soul until it shines from within. So if you find yourself walking alone, do not despair. You are not falling apart. You are falling inward. You are not lost. You are being shaped. And one day you will look back and realize the loneliness that once broke you was the solitude that set you free. At the end of every journey, there comes a silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of understanding. It's that still moment when the noise of the world fades and you sense that something deep within you has shifted. You may not have the words for it, but you feel it. A calm presence, a quiet certainty that wasn't there before. That is the voice of your own soul, finally heard. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he never said this process was painless. To become yourself means to lose illusions, to let go of borrowed identities, to endure the loneliness of standing apart from the crowd. It means facing your inner wilderness and realizing that you were never meant to escape it, but to build a home within it. Nietzsche understood this too. He saw the modern human as someone surrounded by comfort, but starved of meaning, and so he called for courage. Not the courage of battle, but the courage of solitude, the courage to think for oneself, to feel deeply, to endure misunderstanding, because to live truthfully is to walk paths that others may not see. And yet, this is where the beauty lies. For in solitude, you discover that life was never asking you to become someone else. It was asking you to return, to remember. To remember the child who once looked at the sky with wonder. To remember the dream you buried beneath what makes sense. To remember that you are not a machine for achievement, but a soul made to experience depth. This remembering is not grand. It is quiet. It happens in the spaces between things, in the soft light before dawn, in a journal entry written at 2 a.m., in the moment you finally breathe without needing to perform. That is where the transformation takes root, because solitude isn't the absence of love. It's the soil where love grows. It's where you stop chasing connection and start radiating it, where you realize that being alone and being alive are not opposites, they are companions. Nietzsche and Jung, though different in temperament, both arrived at this truth. To live meaningfully, you must walk through your own depths. You must descend into your chaos, confront your shadow, and emerge not unscarred, but authentic. And authenticity, when finally embraced, brings with it an unexpected peace. You begin to understand that you don't need to be understood by everyone, that your path doesn't have to make sense to others, that your solitude is not a wound, but a well, deep, mysterious, and sustaining. If there steps one thing to take from this journey, it is this: you were never meant to live disconnected from yourself. The world will always demand that you fit in, but your soul will always whisper for you to stand out. Not for attention, but for truth. Not to be above others, but to be with yourself. And so perhaps in the quiet moments of your own life, you shall remember this: loneliness is not your enemy, it's your initiation. It's the doorway through which the fragmented self becomes whole again. If you can walk through that doorway, if you can sit with your aloneness long enough for it to turn into peace, you will find something that no external validation can offer: freedom. The freedom to think, to create, to love, and to be. And in that freedom, you will finally understand what both Jung and Nietzsche were pointing toward all along: that the goal of life is not comfort, nor conformity, but becoming what only you can be, becoming what you already are. And in the end, when the last echo of loneliness fades into silence, you will hear it, the soft, eternal whisper that was always there: you are enough. You always were.